Hello and welcome to this Landecker seminar titled Fighting Terror, the Securitization and Protection of Minorities. My name is Marietta van der Tol and I'm the Alfred Landecker Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. I'm especially excited to introduce to you Beatrice de Graaf and Federica d'Alessandra, who will be speaking this evening. Beatrice is Professor of History in IR and Global Governance at Utrecht University. She is, besides a brilliant historian, also a renowned counterterrorism expert who frequently builds bridges between academia, policy advising, and popular media. She leads the ERC Consolidator Grant Securing Europe and is a fellow with the ISIS Files project with the George Washington University. In that capacity, she recently published a book documenting interviews with jailed jihadists from around the world. Today, Beatrice will present some of her historical research based on her book Fighting Terror, which came out with Cambridge University Press just last year. She will share a rather innovative narrative about the rise of nation states in Europe, building her narrative around an emerging security culture in Europe and considering the impact of this securitization on minorities in newly forming nation states. Federica d'Alessandra will reflect on this argument based on contemporary issues around secularization of minorities around the world. Federica is the founding executive director of the Oxford Programme on International Peace and Security at the Blavatnik School of Government and also a member of the steering committee of the Alfred Landecker Programme. She often advises governments and international organizations on the law of the use of force, the laws of armed conflict, and on international human rights law. She is also completing a biography of Benjamin Ferencz, who served as a prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials. Welcome to you both. And with that, I would like to give the floor to you, Beatrice.
Thank you so very much, Marietta, and I'm very happy to be here and also happy but a little bit nervous to share this very historical material with you. But I think there are bridges that can be built on this history that reach up until the present day. I'm now going to start to share my presentation with you. Here it is. Yes. So today I would like to take you back to the era that saw the emergence of minority rights as a category of international and security politics. And that's my thesis, the time immediately following the Napoleonic regimes and the wars. I will make the following case today. So minority rights, first of all, cannot solely be considered an object of international public law, nor a category of universalist rights and moralism. They need to be historicized to truly understand the dynamics that shape and institutionalize them. My second claim, the issue of minority rights was put on the agenda within the context of a transformative regime of collective security after 1815, where the international configuration of empire, states and their hierarchy mattered as much as the domestic stratification of the emerging unitary nation states. And the third claim, the issue of minorities was put on the agenda not as an issue of rights and claims, but as an object of securitization. And securitization is, in the words of Buzan and de Wilde, the process of state actors transforming subjects from regular political issues into matters of security. So repeat, the process of state actors transforming subjects from regular political issues into matters of security, thus enabling extraordinary means to be used in the name of security. I base these claims on my research into the Allied Council. It's an association of 4 empires that defeated Napoleon in 1815 and that ran the occupation of France between 1815 and 1818 with 1.2 million soldiers, which established the Quadruple Alliance, a type of proto-NATO dominating the European continent and beyond. And the work of the Allied Council obviously is associated with the Vienna Congress, of which you've all heard probably, but it has been ignored very much. And it is important. This is why I wrote a book about this. And it is considered reverberating in today's UN Security Council, where still 3 of the great powers of 1815 have a seat. So starting with the first claim, that minority rights should be considered an object of international public law, not so much, and more object of international collective security politics. What do I mean with that? Well, in the aftermath of the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, a new system of collective security was created. We've all heard about this. But what is quite unknown is that this system was quite consciously, explicitly created as a hierarchy of empires with first, second, and third rank states. And this post-1815 hierarchy emerged in the fight against revolutionary and Bonapartist terror. Terror was important. Let me elaborate. The collective fight against terror, embraced by the post-Napoleonic community of states, carved out the contours of 19th century Europe. When on March 25, 1815, the last coalition against Napoleon was forged and committed itself to a system of mutual security, it created not only a wartime alliance, but also a peacetime alliance, fighting and preventing the terror unleashed by the French revolutionary and Bonapartist hybrids. Terror was defined both as the threat of armed Jacobinism, terror regimes unleashing their wars of conquest in Europe, striving for hegemony, but it was also considered a non-state threat, perhaps more like the way we understand it today, by revolutionary, disgruntled ethnic or religious or political groups. So in essence, the terror first and foremost pertained to the trauma of this global world war, the total war, as David Bell called it, 5 million people, death, lands destroyed. But it also pertained to this lingering threat after 1815 to these new interests of peace and security, of the landed elites, of the bankers, the property owners. And the object of securitization was the terror, but it was far more also these non-state groups that may continue the terror, not just in Europe, but also in the Mediterranean, the pirates, North Africa, and also in the colonies. And to support this fight, the ruling empires did not break up their alliance, concluded the final act of Vienna, but even more importantly, they committed themselves to the Paris Treaty and the Quadruple Alliance Treaty of November 1815. And this treaty called for a proactive maintenance and consolidation of the balance of power, resting on these 4 first-rank powers, the 4 Quadruple Alliance powers of Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And this was not just something that can be considered restorative or conservative or backward. It was also very much in the hearts and minds of liberal ministers, such as Castlereagh, who harbored the same stratified view of the international state system, because they also wanted to uphold the security. You can see it here. They're sitting around the Green Bay stable, planning the security of Europe. And this security of Europe was first of all supported by these first-rank nations, the 4 great powers, and they made sharp distinctions between the secondary, the second-class powers, Spain, Portugal, some German states, Italian states, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And then there was the third category, the separate petty sovereignties that were better off wiped out of the map of Europe altogether, and they could be glad that they were allowed to still exist. Well, after 1815, these rather general ideas on ranks and hierarchy gained serious traction on the ground. What you see here is the minutes and the protocols that we stitched together based on a number of archives throughout Europe that convey to us the minutes and the protocols of this Quadruple Alliance Council that existed for a number of years. And interestingly enough, it was consisted of those 4 power representatives, but representatives of the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, and Germany were also allowed to sometimes visit, stop by, and discuss, for example, minority rights with the large power. So this is the international hierarchy of states. How did it translate into a national stratification of the unitary nation states that were arising? That's the second step. This international hierarchy was supported by the new unitary nation states, which went through an unprecedented transformation of their own. The layered, messy system of rights and rules and privileges of the ancient regime empires gave way to a process of modernization, corresponding to and influenced by this stratified system of international cooperation. According to Bailey, the features of father state were now much more carved out in the government's actions, much more evident and more rational, his words, than they had been in the 18th century. And this international hierarchy, the consortium that formed the Quadruple Alliance, impacted on the post-1815 stratification of societies in several ways. The four great powers colonized the continent. If we discuss process of colonization, we often point to the overseas territories. But my point, and not just my point alone, it's also historians like Cooper, Lisa Ford, Lauren, sorry, I lost her name, Bentham, they also make the point that the colonization abroad, overseas, also happened in a fashion in Europe as such. They colonized the continent, they transformed it into a region of industrious activity, peace and security, based on a complex system of ranking social and population or ethnic groups. And the final act of Vienna did identify and define minorities and national groups, prescribed minimal standards of protection, for example, for the Jews. And this is interesting because the final act of the Congress of Vienna introduced a clause that for the first time in history extended protection not just to religious minorities, but also to national minorities. And the ground for this innovation was not an ambition to live up to universalist ideas. It was an attempt to console the peoples that had lost their territory with the fate of being partitioned. First and foremost, the Polish minority. They were granted some rights within this new post-1850 system as an indemnity to lost territories. The first article of the final act of the Congress of Vienna read, the Poles, respectively subjects of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, shall obtain a representation of their national institutions regulated according to the mode of political existence that each of these governments to which they belong will judge useful and appropriate to grant them. Yet, this system of hierarchical collective security resting on these new unitary states was not beneficial to these minority rights whatsoever. On the contrary, it inspired European attempts at external and internal projects of colonization. European commissions, for example, colonized the Rhine, did away with many privileges of petty regimes. It opened the deltas of the Scheldt for free trade, and they controlled the minorities if it did not align with commercial and imperial interests. For example, number of dissent and protests that erupted against this Holy Alliance, against this Quadruple Alliance, played out in proto-terrorist attacks on the Duke of Wellington, on the Duke of Berry, on August of Kotzebue, all notables of the Restoration in Europe. It also played out in ingrained and widespread corruption and protests staged by the Belgian workers who had to erect a defense line against France for the newly erected Kingdom of the Netherlands. To illustrate how the securitization, my third claim, of minorities was a product of both this hierarchical international order and the corresponding stratification of these new nation states, I will conclude with a brief overview on how the Netherlands dealt with their minorities, the Belgians and the Indonesian people. Interestingly enough, these minorities were both religious minorities and ethnic minorities, and the way they were configured into the body of this new empire, this new kingdom, was still very open and porous. Just a couple of days after the return of Napoleon from Elba, on the 16th of March 1815, the Dutch sovereign Prince William of Orange proclaimed the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The kingdom was officially established only after the final act of Vienna was concluded, the king was crowned, the constitution accepted, and a new state was formed. In comparison to 1795, the kingdom was augmented with the territory of the Habsburg Netherlands, Belgium, and with some French cities, expanding the borders of the Orange monarchy up until northern France. Moreover, the Prince of Orange, via the Duchy of Luxembourg and later also Limburg, became a member of the German Confederation, lifting the Netherlands in terms of people, wealth and trade almost to the rank of Prussia, but it still remained a second-rank country and was subjugated to this Quadruple Alliance system. It was called the lapdog of the Congress system by Metternich. This is not something that the King of the Netherlands liked a lot. He called himself rather, in the words that Castlereagh used, the bulwark of Europe, the boulevard de l'Europe. Why? Because it was the linchpin in the defense of European alliance, geared towards together against future French aggression. And the political union between the Netherlands and Britain was also the conduit between the Netherlands and Prussia. It was, international speaking, a satellite of England, a partner of Prussia, and it concluded several inter-imperial treaties with London to establish joint cooperation on the open waters. And thus, it played a pivotal role along the first-rank powers to consolidate and uphold the new hierarchical order. and it also helped to suppress any attempt by minorities to thwart that order. First of all, the Belgian Catholic minority had been integrated into the system of unitary rule under a Protestant king and forced into a complete union with the Northern Netherlands. Though the kingdom was bilingual officially, French-speaking Catholic elites were forced to give up their old privileges and accept King William's Hollandization policies. And this infringement they did not like at all. Consequently, from Brussels, Bonapartist exiles, Catholic renegades issued a relentless stream of protests, vilifying the new kingdom, the Quadruple Alliance as such, and they even made out that the Dutch king was a puppet kingdom. So they were protesting the European great powers in protesting the Dutch king. This was enough reason for Metternich and the Allied Council to pressurize The Hague into implementing far more restrictive measures against freedom of speech and association. In the old Dutch Republic, there had been quite a level of tolerance, religious freedom, freedom of speech. But now, in this new unitary kingdom, the King of the Netherlands was forced by the other courts, the four Quadruple Alliance courts, to curtail the constitutional principles that safeguarded the minorities. The Duke of Wellington, chair of the council, presented a memorandum regarding the libels published in the Low Countries, and he said the rogue writings by minorities that sparked rebellion and perverted public opinion needed to be put down. And the four great powers demanded from the Dutch king to banish all persons on the blacklist, just expel them from the territory, prosecute the minorities who abused the freedom, and put all those people on a blacklist that they felt were subverting the order. And then with the blacklist, anything could happen after all. In short, a growing group of radicals, liberals, other minorities provoked new anxieties about security. They were securitized. And at first, they were suppressed rather effectively. But as you all know, in 1813, this did not function anymore. This brings me to the second issue of securitizing minorities as an object both of international and new unitary state security politics. King William, as the enlightened despot that he was, set out to reorganize Dutch trade and shipping and established in the years after 1815 a so-called culture of cultivation system in the Dutch Indies. This was a kind of revenue system. It rested on forced production of crops for the Dutch treasure or on forced labor. So the citizens, more on the citizens aspect, but the people in Indonesia could choose either they had to work 1/5 of their year's work for the Dutch treasury, or they just had to hand over 1/5 of their crops. And how did the Dutch force these peoples that lived in the Dutch Indies to do so? Well, together with the British in Malaysia, they established a system of control over the Southeast Asian archipelagos. They fought alleged pirates together, indigenous tribes, to establish spheres of influence. They securitized the raids, the protests, the rebellion as a subversion of this new international security order. They expanded their colonies in 1820. They concluded a treaty with Britain in 1824. In order to allegedly liberate the Indonesian, the indigenous people, as they called it, from their rulings and superstitions and integrate them into their system of commerce and trade. After 1815, as Lauren Bent and Elisa Ford have argued in The Rage for Order, the Dutch Code of Law was implemented to structure and align existing overlapping systems of law and land regulations. And this was established to exist beside and above the local legal systems. And this legal stratification was sustained by a stratification of citizenship, taking shape in the following decades as well. You have to remember, up until 1800, the VOC, the Dutch Trading Company, was in charge. It was not a country, it was a series of outposts, of trade posts. Only after 1815, the Dutch Indies were integrated in the Dutch kingdom, and the question of citizenship arose. And this citizenship defined who was to be mentioned, who was to be integrated in the body of the state as a proper citizen, what kind of legal codifications this was founded on, and also which minorities were less protected and could be used for forced labor. in the 1830s, 40s, a kind of stratification emerged. It was only codified in 1854, and it was a threefold system. This is the Dutch Empire. The red places are the Dutch territories, colonial territories in Indonesia. And this is the stratification that was in place up until the 20th century. It was a threefold scheme. There were Europeans, and included in the Europeans were also so-called Indo-Europeans, Eurasians, people who were born out of Dutch men and native women, where the Dutch fathers had to acknowledge officially the children. Then they were also accounted for as Europeans. The inlanders, those were the Indonesian people living in the colonies, for example, people on Java, and there were the foreign Orientals. These were Chinese and Arabs mostly, because the Japanese, since they were an empire which the Dutch traded with centuries before, were considered Europeans as well. So it was a threefold system, which was not a product of universalist ideals, but modeled upon this new collective security scheme that the Dutch with the British had rolled out in Southeast Asia. And it was informed predominantly by opportunistic and pragmatic commercial interest. It served economic purposes, it served security purposes, because once you were codified an inlander, you were prohibited to move across the isles, across the archipelago. You have to remain put to your place of birth, to your place where you were working, and you were counted upon as a person obliged to carry out forced labor. We can have far much longer and extensive discussion on this, but let me come to my conclusion. What I have tried to describe here in brief is that the post-Napoleonic New World has been crucial to the development of nation states, but also crucial to the way minorities, religious and national minorities, have been categorized, regulated, marginalized, and it has also been crucial for the way the post-1815 order has subjected these minorities to security considerations predominantly. So it's not the legacy of the French Revolution, universalist moral claims. It was security interests that drove the stratification and the handling of minorities. With Cooper and Bailey, I already made this point, process of colonization, modernization, and stratification of societies in the West and in the East are interwoven. And I think it's far more important not just to do either new imperial history and new European history, but connect the two, because this phenomenon of interconnectedness and interdependencies helps us explain the secularization of minorities as a very deep and ingrained process in European history. This system, the European system of minority protection, came into existence after 1815, but it was not created and not designed to uphold or increase the progress of minority protection. Only very specific minimal standards were fleshed out, were embedded in treaty clauses. On the contrary, it's far more the case that these color lines that, for example, emerged in Indonesia, they were subject of this system of commercial trade, of the forced labor, and was resting far more on opportunistic, pragmatic notions of profit-making than on universalist claims. So in short, securitization of minorities has profoundly shaped legal structures, still reverberates in contemporary approaches to minorities, and the way minorities are framed, securitized as terror threats, for example. Both the hierarchy of the international order in the global perspective and in the EU still translates into this stratification and these hierarchies of security mechanisms, from dealing with separatist movements to dealing with religious minorities and launching wars against terror in far away countries. So thank you very much for your attention.
Could I go ahead, Marietta? Well, thank you, Professor de Graaf, for this extremely interesting set of remarks. And of course, thank you to Marietta and the seminar for inviting me to respond. Listening to your rich historical overview of how minorities have been conceptualized and legislated as a security problem, and how these trends have evolved, particularly in the European context, prompts me to reflect on what the current state of affairs is, if one might, particularly from my own disciplinary perspective, and specifically building on this last point that you raised, with the caveat that I will try to link, I will try to tie what I'll say to my background in human rights and atrocity prevention. And in the spirit of maybe prompting some further, but hopefully complementary reflection, what I'll do is I'll try to map out the ways in which I see the specific nexus between the securitization of minorities and the risk or potential for atrocities playing out. I thank everybody in advance for indulging me during these remarks, and for your patience if I make any category mistakes, because I'm still refining my thinking around these issues. So if I do make any such mistakes, I welcome your thoughts and feedback. So the first point I want to make is that when we talk about state action concerning the protection of minorities and how it relates to security, we generally speak across four main domains. One being equality and non-discrimination, effective and meaningful participation is the second. The third is the promotion and protection of minority identity. And the third is the minority's survival and existence. And when speaking of the nexus between minority rights protection and atrocities, I think it makes the most sense to start from this latter and most extreme place, meaning actions that threaten minority survival and existence. At this far end of the spectrum, it is extremely rare, in my view, to find measures that challenge directly minority survival and existence, even on security grounds. If any other reason, because such laws or policies, if stated as such, would be indisputable proof of genocidal intent. However, states' actions implemented on security grounds can chip away a minority's ability to survive and exist, as, for example, it's been the case with the Rohingyas in Myanmar. And at this extreme end of the spectrum, in any case, these measures will form such a thick tapestry of repressive measures to leave no other reasonable inference to be drawn other than they're imposed with the intent to discriminate against, and in the case of genocide, of course, destroy the minority in whole or in part. So security rhetoric here is, in my view, less relevant. Genocide, however, is not the only atrocity crime that has potential nexus to this discussion on the securitization of minorities. I think both the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity can be often tied to this issue. First, states securitize responses to minorities' demands or the perceived threat that minorities posed is often itself a driver of conflict. Excessive securitization can provoke resentment and backlash. Marginalizing groups can make them question regime legitimacy because it may deny them the space to participate. So they will turn to violence. And we may see cycles of escalation and violent interactions between the state and minority groups, which might eventually escalate in full-blown conflicts. And within the context of these internal conflicts, where particularly where these might have a sectarian component along ethnic or religious lines, states will often deploy counterinsurgency measures that might result in the commission of war crimes or other atrocities themselves. And this is also true for cross-border action, where insurgents, which might be grouped around minority characteristics, might pose a security threat from outside of the state's territory. And in fact, this is the basis on which I think most internationalized conflicts today are fought. However, it is not just states, but insurgents whose conduct can lead to these outcomes in sectarian conflicts. Non-state actors, in my view, are less likely to adopt security rhetoric when persecuting minorities, because to insurgents, the greatest security threat is posed by the state itself. But this is obviously a horrible case scenario because civilians are caught in the crossfire between a repressive government on the one end and an abusive non-state actor on the other, with the perpetrator of these atrocities becoming whoever has the capacity to impose these measures that violate their humanitarian law obligations. In the case among non-state groups and insurgents, I think there is a particular category of non-state groups where by the security rhetoric might become more pertinent, but it's not in the traditional sense of a physical security threat. Rather, in these cases, I think minorities can become a threat to the security of insurgent ideals, be political ideals, or in the case of fundamentalist insurgencies, religious ideals. So minority groups can be targeted because they're perceived as either threatening ideals of religious purity or because they may be seen as taking the side of the government in a political struggle for supremacy and statehood and self-determination, thus threatening insurgents' political aspirations. It is, in my view, however, outside of areas of conflict where I think the nexus between the securitization of minorities and the risk of atrocity becomes most urgent. Because of the lurking potential for atrocities, including crimes against humanity, but at a minimum, very serious human rights violations, laying at the very end of an escalating trends of built-up security measures. And this case scenario is most urgent in my view, not only because it affects autocratic states, which, by the way, are also most likely to fall in the previous two case scenarios, but also because it has bearing for liberal democracies as well. This is the case scenario in which, as already pointed by Professor de Graaf, suspension to minority rights protection is most often justified on security grounds to counter some real or perceived physical threat that minority themselves are often imputed to be the threat. There are two potential case scenarios that fall under this rubric, in my view. The first one, as it's the case with genocide, except more convincingly because the intent to discriminate may not be as blatant, the security rhetoric is often adopted to conceal other political goals. Although security measures, including as they relate to terrorism, provided ample grounds for minority abuse, even in liberal states, I personally take the view that it is most often than not autocratic and in liberal states, or at least it has been the case in modern times, that will fall in this case scenario, using the terrorism label as a fig leaf to conceal other goals, which might range from repression of dissent, case of Turkey and the Kurds, forced assimilation, as is the case with China and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, or expulsions, which might range from ethnic cleansing to genocidal campaigns, such as the one perpetrated by the Tatmadaw in Myanmar. The best indicator, in my opinion, of the fact that these measures are fig leaf for other goals is the fact that, contrary to what international law requires, derogation and suspension of minority rights in these cases will neither be absolutely necessary on security grounds nor temporary. Rather, in many such cases, the measures that are adopted on security grounds will end up piling on to what is an already existing tapestry of institutionalized discrimination and consistent minority disadvantage. And this, over time, can turn from suspension of minority rights into their overall denial. In these case scenarios, security policies leading to minorities abuse can become so widespread and systematic as to amount themselves to atrocity crimes. And this is, for example, what's happening, in my view, with China's conduct in Xinjiang, which is, by the way, one particular example of policies, discriminatory and persecutory policies that are grounded in security and specifically counter-terrorist rhetoric. And this is where I think the role of legislation and regulation of minorities as security threats becomes the most cogent. And that's because legislative actions and the carving out of gray areas or alternative legal architecture often become part and parcel of a gradual but systematic build-up to the commission of other international crimes. The other case scenario under this rubric is the one that I think is most applicable to liberal and democratic states as well. And that's where domestic policies justified on security grounds, but with this discriminatory component, are at a minimum themselves abusive in some form, though they might not necessarily raise to the threshold of atrocities. However, the public rhetoric that often accompanies these measures will contribute to entrenching societal divisions, fueling sectarian grievances, and the expression of these might often turn violent. So, and this is obviously the case even when the level of violence doesn't raise to the threshold of full-blown conflict. Of course, some legitimate security threats do exist that might demand a security response, but I think history, and Professor de Graaf will correct me if I'm wrong about this, but history consistently has shown that equating these threats with an entire minority group will almost invariably backfire. What's worse in these case scenarios where the dehumanization of the minorities alongside their depiction of security threats is made part of the public rhetoric, this will most often than not, of course, ensure public support for these measures, but in some very bad case scenarios might actually fuel atrocities perpetrated, if not by the state, by some paramilitary organization at the expense of the minority. I guess at one point, sub-point worth making here is that beyond the official rhetoric or the public perceptions in these case scenario, most often than not, it isn't the minority itself that poses the biggest security threat, including that terrorist threat. Although, of course, that's very possible. I think there's the risk that the mere perception by the majority that this be the case scenario, however, might turn the most radicalized individuals within the majority into themselves the security threat. And here the case of violent white supremacy comes to mind. So to conclude, I think in all of the case scenarios that I've outlined where I think I see and I can draw a nexus between the securitization of minority in some form and the commission of atrocity crimes, there are a few questions that are worth asking. And I think these are particularly relevant for our democratic and liberal societies. So these questions are: who drives notions of security, these notions of security threats? What tools do they use? What contributes to uptake of over-securitized practices over time? Who's the security working for? And what are the implications of choosing certain approaches over others? But also, how do we respond to these processes to encourage desecuritization? How do we make sure that major global events, such as the pandemic, for example, are not used to exploit citizens' fears and to implement harsher security policies? And most importantly, I think, do we need an alternative intellectual network and framework that argues for more measured policies rather than these tendency, a knee-jerk tendency to over-securitize responses to threats and challenges? So I guess I'll leave us all with those questions, and I look very much forward to your thoughts during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federica and Beatrice. Let's give them a round of applause. If you know where to find your clap function in Zoom, or otherwise just by clapping in person. I think, you know, the perspectives are obviously very different. Beatrice is a historian, Federica comes from international law, but I think there are some really important narrative to be seen, namely that of securitization, particularly as scholars in political theory and particularly in constitutional theory have a tendency to over-idealize what has happened after the French Revolution and how nation states have come into being. and particularly with regards to notions of citizenship, the narratives that that shared citizenship would overcome all the tensions of the early modern period and the wars of religion and all the other cruelties and difficulties of a time far behind us. And I think it is really a starting point for a conversation that I think, as you rightly say, Federica, could be more measured about what is it actually that has been happening with minorities in Europe, but also beyond Europe. I think I would like to open with one particular question for Beatrice, relating to the use of the language of public order and peace in the early modern period, particularly because we see that there is already a concern about security attached to the notion of public order in the early modern period, and where privileges rather than rights are also dependent on public order and kind of the silencing of minorities, or at least making minorities less visible, as I've written in my own dissertation. And I wonder, Beatrice, if you could comment on that, if you see perhaps there is a continuity between that type of discourse and what you see in the securitization in the early 19th century, or if there is a clear kind of contribution, as it were, of Enlightenment themes in this post-Napoleonic security system. Would you like to respond to that, or have some time to think about that, Beatrice?
I can start with a beginning of a response, Marietta, which can't be complete, I think. Well, as I already tried to point out, there is a huge difference in the state system of the post-1815 order and the state system in the Westphalian situation. And it has to do with the fact that after 1815, both internationally and domestically, this system was far more controlled and codified, which was already induced by Napoleon himself with the Code Civil, the Code Napoleon, and also this Quadruple Alliance Treaty, which also talked about peace and order as did previous treaties. But this treaty was not a treaty to prepare for war. It was not a kind of a solidarity treaty. It was a peacetime treaty. And it's sort of designed a way of maintaining peace and order in times where the war was over. And this also translated in real instruments of security organization. After the Westphalian treaties were concluded, the representatives went home. And they had stayed there to negotiate the treaty, and then they went home and did their own things. After 1815, these diplomats, the ministers, the generals, the engineers, they stuck together. They formed this Allied Council. They organized other types of conference, the London Conference. They set up defense councils amongst themselves, and they really developed instruments of security that were kept in place. For example, who knew that black lists were already in place after 1815? Surveillance agencies were erected in 1815 in Paris, and then 1819 by Metternich. There was a whole network of spies and this was still very haphazard and also porous, and there were, of course, many lacunas throughout Europe, but there was an attempt to control, to internally colonize this unruly territory of Europe. And the most unruly parts were located in Brussels, also in Krakow, where those rebellious, seditious minorities were taking shelter. And they were persecuted and prosecuted, banned, expelled. And the same happened in the colonies. So I think with the Napoleonic transformation of Europe, with this 1815 new order, both the modernization of the international system, but also the modernization of controlling the subjects of these empires, the system set in. And this happened parallel both in Europe and in the territories beyond. And this insight, I think, should be elaborated in far more detail. It's not just the inter-imperialist genocidal attempts that started to take place in the last part of the 19th century. It already is inaugurated here.
Thank you, Beatrice. I think Marka has a question. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I found it very interesting. So I love Beatrice's presentation, and it fascinates me in part at a very just personal level, because in my one part on my father's side, I come from a Slovakian background where I'm very aware of sort of that colonial history, while in my professional work, I work on post-colonialism and colonialism, but never really had a sense. I always had a kind of hanging question of how can I relate those? And Beatrice now starts to give me wonderful ideas about that. So I really love that. And then at the same time, I was very struck sort of in the discussion between Beatrice and Federica of what you remarked on, Marietta, about sort of the historical relative to the present. And so I was thinking about, so I have two questions. So the first one gets at that one in terms of a very specific case for a larger question. And that question is, if we're thinking about what the relation of the historical is to the present, right? And why, Beatrice, you might say, yes, but Federica, you need to understand this history if you want to do this or that, or understand this or that, right? So if we're thinking about the relation of the historical to the present and of the European to the global, right? If we take the Chinese communist response to what's going on in Xinjiang right now as an example, right? I'm wondering, like, would you, I don't think you would, but one could think you might want to say, oh, well, what we see happening there, right, which the ways in which the Communist Party is securitizing that issue of a religious and ethnic minority, that is an extension of this 19th century logic we see developing within continental Europe. I could imagine sort of pushing back against that because there's certain sort of Orientalist and colonial sensibilities embedded in that way of seeing it. But I'm wondering if that is sort of the argument you're making as we move into the global and into the present. And then the second question I have, which is, I was very interested, Beatrice, in how you were comparing Belgium and the Dutch East Indies. And then I'm wondering about Suriname. And I'm sure you've thought about it, maybe you wrote about it in your book, which I haven't read yet, right? But Suriname is really interesting because it's right at that intersection as a Dutch colony, but in the Caribbean within the slave economy and sort of that whole logic. So you see it's a place of encounter between the ways in which that logic of securitization, nation, state, race, religion was taking place in continental Europe, and then the very different ways in which that's taking place in the Anglo-American sphere in relation to, you know, slavery and indigenous peoples and so forth. Yeah, how do you see, like, do you know something, like, can you tell us a little bit more about Suriname? Do you think that is a feasible way of seeing what's going on there as a kind of encounter between continental European and Anglo-American ways of doing it, or should I be thinking in a, you know, different direction?
Thank you, Marka, for these questions. Am I unmuted? Yes. These are tremendous, challenging and difficult questions, because I am not working under the pretense that I'm a truly global historian. I'm not. I struggle to understand processes in Europe and beyond. So my focus of research is Europe and beyond, with the beyond being the object of European imperial international politics. So what is beyond that, for example, with China, sort of eludes me to go into that in detail. So your first part of the question, whether the processes in China of repressing and securitizing minorities as we speak is a kind of a mirror, or where European processes reverberate, that I find very difficult to tell, because China has a trajectory of repression and a trajectory of imperial rule of its own, and also ideologies, legal codes, and codification of citizen subjects of its own that I'm not familiar with. My point is that based on this research in Europe, on the way minorities in Europe were embedded in treaties, legal codes came into existence, one gets sometimes the impression that it's a Whiggish interpretation of history from the French Revolution up until the present time, where we have this process of increasingly more freedom and increasingly more minority rights, whereas in reality, these minority rights always were, and still to a very large extent are, the subject or the object of inter-imperial power and commercial politics, and there still are. And I think if we lose sight of that and only claim with human rights that there is this universalist ambition that we should strive for, and I'm all for that, we forget that this great power ranking of international society still determines, up until the present day, whether we give enough attention to minorities or not. And there is, let me introduce one more dimension to this discussion. There is now in Germany, and Katharina can perhaps tell us more about that, a discussion going on about genocide. And Dirk Moses has launched a very famous, or infamous to some, article, and he wants to break up this German catechism of pronouncing the Holocaust as a unique instance of genocide. And Dirk Moses instead counters and says, well, the genocide, and he's not the first one who did this. There's also this book, Levine's Genocide in the Age of the Nation State, who also makes the claim that the potentiality for genocide, first of all, arose in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, exactly my period, because there the modern unitary nation states started to work together in order to commodify the world, colonize the world, and in an increasingly desperate and unrestrained competition for sovereign autonomy and trade opportunities, they repressed and they wiped out the minorities that stood up against them, which is genocidal in potentiality. So I think this aspect, which is now being raised by historians, to look closer into those genealogies, the historization, the causations of genocide, that's so important to understand why some minority rights matter to us, some do less, why states, when states intervene, and when interventions work and when not. And this is, as a historian, always my kind of goal, to show how the things really are, instead of only hoping for a better world, to put it very bluntly. So this is very much where I come from, I think. This is by far not a response to your questions, Marka, but sort of an opening for a discussion.
Maybe if I can just jump in with a couple of additional thoughts. First of all, I completely subscribe to everything that Beatrice has just said. And I also especially subscribe to the point that I can provide a nowhere close to a comprehensive answer to your first question in particular. But I guess as I was listening to Beatrice speak, two particular issues that jumped to mind and my worth thinking about in the context of your first question, or I guess three issues are, the first is, I think relating to the last point I made in my presentation, who defines which minorities' rights are worth protecting and based on what interest? So exactly as Beatrice said, it isn't exclusively because we all believe in this idea that, you know, through the protection of human rights, we'll all get to a better place. But within that system of beliefs, there is going to be a prioritization and deprioritization, and that's going to be contingent on certain interests, you know, real politic interest. And I think in the case of, you know, China, Xinjiang, it's I think that there is good argument, good ground there to support the argument that there is definitely an economic component to that repression. The other, I guess, point that I wanted to raise is, you know, just as we think about who defines what are grounds for protection and what constitutes as a minority and what the role of minorities is and what their space of minorities is within the international human rights system, we also maybe want to think about who shapes the what qualifies as legitimate grounds for departing from this minority protection, right? So what I'm thinking here specifically is the ways in which the after 9/11 in particular, there has been this emergence of a security industry and community that maybe not into dissimilar ways, and actually I'd love to get Beatrice's thoughts on this, have shaped the way we think about departure from minorities protection on security grounds, kind of in maybe similar ways in which we started to see from 1815 in Europe. And so, you know, given the prominence that counterterrorism rhetoric has gained since then, you know, is that made it more possible, as that lowered the threshold or provided better grounds for excuses to those who were intending on breaking minority protection in the first place, but to do it according to what is now a fairly common and accepted rationale.
Do you want me to react to this directly, Marietta?
If you like to, please, yes.
Yes, well, let me take up this last remark on minorities in the post 9/11 world. I think, again, I mean, history is not just doesn't just give us blueprints for interventions, or doesn't just give us a toolbox for predictions, but it helps us with analogies. And sometimes analogies help us to see better what the wicked problems of today are. And if you don't consider the trauma of 9/11, if you don't consider the upheaval, globally speaking, of this war on terror, you don't understand how vulnerable minority rights are. And as in 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, these 25 years and these millions of people dead, there was a huge window of opportunity to come down hard on any source that was considered terroristic terror by the contemporaries in those days. And the same happened after 9/11. And this is obviously not something that I condone at all, but it is a fact that after 9/11, minorities and indigenous people worldwide suffered very strongly from the after effects of the attacks. And in many regions after the 9/11 attacks, a clash inflamed between freedom of religion, freedom of expression. If you take, for example, Iraq, which was subject to a US-led military intervention, minorities were caught between all sides, religious minorities, political minorities, they were targets of violence. And well, there's this minority rights group that has been monitoring how the war on terror impacts on minorities. And well, it's a huge increase of refugees, a huge increase of infringements. And it's important to just identify, categorize, understand what is going on there. And it's also important to see this as a problem of geopolitical securitization, not just as a problem of law. This means that you should go back to the first-ranked nations that make this happen, as with the Allied Council in 1815, as with the UN Security Council today. So the real problem is not the lacking of legal protections, it's the role of the first-ranked nations in the UN Security Council or in NATO or in Europe. And as long as there is this divide between a minority rights group that monitors things and this coalition of the willing, this coalition of great powers, then that's where I struggle so hard to make sense of what's happening today. I don't know if any of the other people can come up with explanations that bridge this gap.
Katharina, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I do not like to comment, just to thank you, Beatrice, for the lecture. And as a historian by myself, I have just some concrete questions. So I'm not following the round and the comments, but I hope, so maybe, I'm not sure, maybe it would be better to have first Matthias if he would like to comment or go into this round.
Okay, Matthias or Marka, does your question relate to this issue? If so, unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm honestly not sure anymore if I can relate directly. Marka, if you can make a good connection, go ahead.
So maybe then I cannot ask my questions. So I was just, so as a historian by myself, I was just interested in knowing more about how in the sources and in the Congress of Vienna, how was this social group made as an ethnic group? So were there some criteria in the sources, or were there also some, have you found or seen a concept what makes a special social group as an ethnia? Because of course, as a historian, you know that ethnia is also has to be historized. And I'm wondering just if there were some thoughts and some criteria. And of course, I'm quite interested in that question, if there is something like criteria or a concept to label social groups as ethnias. How is then the relationship between religion and the minority groups or the ethnic groups, because very often I would say, if you have shown this map, so some of these minority groups are of course religious groups, or maybe they are linguistic groups. But I'm just wondering how they were dealing with that issue in the middle or in the early 19th century, and to learn something about their historic concepts. And then maybe the last point, I'm just curious because I'm now professor in Helsinki and in Finland. You haven't mentioned the only indigenous people in Europe, the Sami. And I'm just wondering if they were in that time in some ways in the picture, or did you find something about the Sami in the sources, or were they just unknown or not, let's say, not on the picture? But on the other side, of course, the current issues about decolonization in Europe, if you have one discourse about that, so then it is about the Sami to be colonized, about the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Russians. So I'm just wondering if these indigenous people did play any role in the sources in that period.
First, to the first question, thank you, Katarina, for that question. Yes, I went through the sources, and the Congress of Vienna was also famous for having constituted the first statistical committee. And the statistical committee is very important because it counted the souls. People were not considered subjects or citizens, but souls. It also counted the income of taxes, the revenues, the square kilometers of lands and soils that were being negotiated amongst the powers. So for Russia and Prussia and Austria, for example, the matter was how should we divide Saxony and how should we divide Poland amongst ourselves? Because these are the spoils of war. These two countries, or these two duchies, they were the source of lots of evil. And Saxony had clung to Napoleon for too long, and the Polish were just needed for Russia to have a stronger border towards the west. So what they did was they just counted the souls, they listed the territory, and they renegotiated the maps. There was no discussion or definition of ethnic minorities as such, yet the Poles were very vociferous. Tsar Alexander had a number of advisors who were of Polish descent, Czartoryski predominantly. The Polish nobility was a force to reckon with. So what happened was that the Poles received some rights as an indemnity for lost territory. So there was no definition of them being an ethnic minority, a religious minority. It was just these people were Poles. They were listed as Polish souls. Based on what, we do not know. But it was the first time that a group of people were listed in a treaty for minority protection that was not a religious group. Before it had been the Jews, but this was, or the Protestants or the Catholics, but now it was an ethnic, a linguistic group as such. And there was a whole discussion that started to unroll and unfold after that, because the Poles said, well, if we are a group, we are entitled to our own university, we're entitled to our own body of knowledge, we're entitled to our own language, we're entitled to a sign. So there was, after that, it only started the way the Poles defined themselves as an ethnia. So you're completely right that we should historicize ethnies and ethnic minorities, but it wasn't done by means of elaborate definitions at the time itself. It was just stated. Your second question, I'm sorry, it's late. I've been teaching all day. Could you very briefly summarize the second question? Sorry, Katarina.
Yeah, it was, you have just answered it in some way. So it was between the relationship between being in the minority and being a religious, let's say, but I understand. So it was not any longer about religious groups or religious minorities, but it was now the new idea was, let's say, to have the label them as an ethnic group. But the ethnic group, the definition of ethnia is our contemporary definition, I understand.
Well, I'm not so sure. For example, with the Belgians, I'm a little bit more familiar on that point. Interesting thing is that it is not the case that there were no rights before 1815 at all. There were numerous rights. There were the burgerschapszelen, it's called in Dutch, so the citizen's passport, so to speak. per city, the enlisting of people who were member of a guild, for example, the privileges of bishoprics in Belgium to entertain and to maintain and to teach in French. And these were all privileges within the old ancient regime systems. And those privileges were rolled back by the unitary state of the Netherlands after 1815. So, for example, the Bishop of Louvain, Monsieur de Bruyne, he before had run his own education system. He had done everything in French. He could name civil servants to the administrative rule in his area, and then King William entered the picture, and he couldn't do that any longer. And Protestant people could now become a civil servant to the state instead of being Catholic in these Habsburg lands. So it was more that their old privileges were rolled back, that these Belgians, well, they were Belgians, they were Catholic, and they were French speaking. So they started to form themselves as a nation. So this is nation making in nation forming in the making. So they were not an ethnia in a modern sense. They were a religious group. They were a minority, and they were formed as an object of this Dutch Hollandization politics, Nederlandisatie politics. So this politics, this unitary state politics, called them into existence pretty much, which is, I think, the interesting part of it.
And then I had just this question about the indigenous people.
In Indonesia, in the Dutch Indies.
No, in Europe. So if you were there on the, let's say, in the perspective, or were there any thoughts about, or were there the sources?
They were in the sources in as much as they were an object of this new security order. So if you take the Allied Council, these minutes and these protocols, it lists all kinds of attempts to restore order. There were 4 principles: the principle of stabilization, the principle of demilitarization of France, the principle of de-Bonapartization, taking away the threat of terror, and also the principle of dédommagement, reparation payments. And these were the main instruments of restoring peace. And peoples, groups, citizens, bandits, brigands that fought back were considered a terror threat. But there was not a specific handling of minorities as such. Only in 1816, 1817, cities like Krakow and Belgium, Brussels, pop up in the sources as a hotbed for radicalization. These are the places where radicals, where unrest, where sedition is being preached. And that triggers a whole new round of control and surveillance and blacklists. So it's not the ethnic minorities as such, it's the fact that there are people protesting this new security order and committing attacks, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I think before we go to the next question, I would just like to come in here, because one of the things I've noticed in looking at the formation of 19th century states in Europe is that this whole sense of nationhood was actually very much curated. It was very much constructed by political elites, and it was not really part of the consciousness, for example, in the territories that we now consider Germany, and not even in France, which was also divided in all sorts of provinces at the time. And I think what we see is really that the kind of harmonization of the sense of citizenship is about making religious differences less important, is it making linguistic differences less important by imposing a particular language or standardizing a language. So this is really a political process more than a natural process, as it were. And I wonder, actually, now in the light of your presentation, Beatrice, how much that that kind of forced harmonization and convergence of national identity really wasn't a spin-off of this kind of security system. And that is maybe a question that I'll have to sit with for quite a while, but it is certainly a question that that has come up in my mind. I wonder, I think, Marka, your question is relating to the issue that we spoke about before, but I wonder if through your question we might tie these two conversations a little bit together. Would you like to state your question, Marka?
So I was still thinking about that relation between Beatrice and Federica and past and present. And if I understood you right, Beatrice, you were emphasizing, you were saying this is not just a legal issue, but it's also a geopolitical one, right? So you're making the argument that if we look back, we have to understand that there's this geopolitical set of alliances and hierarchies and policies that give shape to that securitization as it takes shape within these individual countries. And then I'm thinking, okay, if we're thinking about the consequences for the present and the consequences for somebody like Federica, right? Does that mean that what you're saying is, even though legal challenges to protecting human rights and to preventing, these kinds of state violence are very vital, they will never actually solve the problem because it's rooted in a geopolitical history. And so that if we want to challenge it, if we want to disrupt this, then you need to combine, you need to have an alliance between the legal and something like transnational social and political movements, for example, or some kind of geopolitical element in there that then allies with the legal in order to effectively challenge it, given it this history. I'm wondering if that's what you're saying. That's what I draw out of it, but I don't know if you would say I'm going too far or if you would agree with that.
No, I think that's a very good summary of what I was trying to say. So thank you for that, Marka. I'm not making the case here for being a realist in terms of international relations. I'd like to say that I'm more a constructivist, because I think that as soon as powerful states come together and create new laws, create legal resolutions and try to live up to them and try to keep each other to them, that this can become a new reality, a new constructed reality. If you take, for example, this famous volume by Matthias Schulz, Normen und Institutionen, he shows how over the course of the long 19th century, this increased, sometimes very haphazard, sometimes intermittent, but this increases, this progress of pressure of these great powers to adopt and implement new legal standards that led into the 1907 conventions, for example. So it was very much the big countries of Europe and the United States who made each other live up to their favorite national identity. They wanted to be states that subscribed to civilization. The long march of the civilizational process also in the colonies, for example. So this is also part of a history which became reality because countries strived to be better than their ancestors in taking care of minorities, for example. So it's not just a power political game that's being run. It's also a constructivist game of taking each other to account on the basis of values. The European community of states also was very much a value community already in 1815, but the values were different and they were not universalist. And I think that's an important point, that with all the universalist claims being made, Martin Koskaniemi also has made this point in his volume, the world is not universalist structured and stratified. So there always will be this gap. And I'm not saying that you should sort of harmonize that gap. That's not possible, but it's not a universalist world in terms of stratification of legal identities.
Maybe if I can just jump in on this point very quickly. I think that the issue that you raised, Marka, and that Beatrice responded to is extremely important. To me, there is a little bit of a qualitative distinction if we're talking about general human rights protection and if we're talking about protection from the worst forms of human rights abuse. So even though I understand and can entertain the value of this discussion around, really what is the role of universalist human rights provisions when we're talking about general human rights protection, I think that we cannot afford the luxury of entertaining the same discussion when we're talking about departure from protection from the worst form of abuse. So I think that, and that's why I wanted to focus on atrocity crimes. To me, atrocity crimes is such a far end of the spectrum that no groupings around potential definitions can arise. We all have to abide and subscribe by those values. Where I think the geopolitical component that you bring to the discussion is worthwhile, even with respect to atrocities and the implementation of protections from atrocities, is the accountability piece. And so how do we build, how do those who do subscribe to those values organize around geopolitical and geostrategic allegiances that might be less maybe values oriented and more interest oriented, but nevertheless speak to those values and seek to uphold those values in terms of human rights protection. How do we leverage those to implement protection from these worst forms of abuse?
Yes, can I briefly jump in here?
Yeah.
Because I really like this argument, Federica, and I totally agree with you, but I like to bring up someone who makes the case that I'm trying to argue far more eloquently. That's Samuel Moyn. And he recently published the book, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World. And he also, as an historian, stresses this point that we have had this liberal international order for many decades with human rights that have been consolidated and inscribed into all our treaties and our constitutions, which is one of the biggest assets of human history. But if you consider this dimension of universalist human rights and you compare it with inequality produced by free trade is the new colonizing powers. If it comes to economics, it's political economy all over again. And China is a case in point. Explosion of inequality there does not listen to human rights at all. So my point is, with Samuel Moyn and others, human rights are very fickle, they're very fragile, and they have been with us only for a couple of decades. And they were able to sort of bridge inequality gaps, try to prevent instances of genocide after the Second World War. But now global inequality is soaring again. And in this world of inequality, of geopolitical rivalry, of new colonization attempts by means of economy, if you like, we need to retell and rephrase this history of human rights. And how we should do that, I'm not sure, and I'm sorry that I don't have an answer there. But I mean, there is this divide, and I'm not seeing it's nearing a closure again. Instead, it's getting wider as we speak with countries like China or Brazil, not living up to human rights at all anymore.
So before we go to Matthijs' question, I wonder if it's worth making or almost reasserting the distinction that we made in the previous seminar, where we talked about religious freedom from the perspective of domestic affairs, but also juxtaposed it with the perspective of international affairs, and that those are two very different spaces in which we may be talking about very similar concepts and concerns, but in which the tools and instruments of addressing these issues are in fact different. And I think in relation to liberal constitutional states, for example, I think Federica's perspective that is perhaps more focusing on the legal structures actually is quite effective in challenging some of the not so legitimate uses of security arguments, particularly in the context of public order. And we have seen that, for example, a French Conseil d'Etat does tell majors and does tell the government that certain actions against Muslims are a grave attack against human rights. And where we do see the Council of States do point out some of the inherent contradictions in the use of security arguments, for example, vis-a-vis the burqa or the niqab, as we've seen in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries. And I think in that sense that there is a real value to I think critiquing uses of the law, but also bearing in mind that that isn't always the final answer, and that actually the geopolitical and power structures that we see at play, particularly in international relations, give a very different ring to these very same conversations. But therefore, I think it's important to see them in relation, but still maintain the treat them as different spaces. I don't know if Federica, Beatrice would like to respond to that before we go to Matthijs' question.
I think you're spot on. I think you absolutely added a qualifier that we probably were dancing around, but we hadn't stated. And I think that having stated it so explicitly adds enormously to framing the discussion. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Can
Matthijs.
I jump in, or have I know I've been talking a lot, so I can also drop it and go to Matthijs.
Okay, I think Matthijs is very happy for Marka to go ahead. So why don't you go ahead, Marka?
Oh, okay. Well, because I wanted to say two things. So I think, yes, I think the work of lawyers who are protecting human rights is vital, and it saves lives, right? So I work, for example, with or I do research on the sanctuary movement that I've also been involved in New York City. And that has a very, very close alliance between religious communities and lawyers who are working with them, plus activists and so forth. And it's critical what the lawyers do. And then at the same time, though, I think that when it comes to atrocities, as long as we have states, we will have atrocities, right? And I think that's my concern, is that in Dutch you have the saying, right, mopping with the faucet open, or mopping with an open faucet, right? So I think that's what my concern is that we will require one generation after another of these, overworked, very invested, very vital and essential lawyers to keep protecting or trying to hold, states and individuals accountable for atrocities. So, and that's why I think there is that geopolitical dimension, because at the moment that a state agrees to be held accountable, and particularly one of the more powerful states, right, like the United States, which has a law for invading The Hague if a US citizen, right, comes in the International Criminal Court. They pass this kind of legislation. So until that kind of legislation, right, is not relevant and states agree to subject themselves and to shed themselves of their sovereignty, right, which will turn them into something else. They will not be nation states the way we understand them now. So I think you need a two-pronged approach where you're both fighting the legal battle and at the same time really reimagining that international system. And particularly because, and this connects it, right, Marietta, you were talking about connecting them, because they are interconnected in the sense that through migration, through social media, through digital technology, that dividing line between the international and the domestic, right, is completely breaking down. And that's part of the problem, is that you have domestic minorities who are being treated with particular harshness because they have attachments to and connections with global collectives that they are understood to be a part of. And so the question of whether a state is securitizing them because they are, these domestic minorities, or particular, like Abderrahmane talks about, fear of small numbers. We have these tiny minorities that, like, for example, Muslims, who we understand as being part of sort of these majorities that are much larger than the Netherlands, for example. So, so I think they can't be kept separate, because you have the neo-realist politics of the international order are being brought to bear within the domestic sphere because of these new developments.
Yes, yet I do think I was fervently thinking of something positive to say, something constructivist, because in 1815, even with this inter-imperial repression of minorities, at the same time, more minority rights were being fought by the minorities themselves. How did they do that? And what sprung to my mind is the role of the Indo-Europeans. It's the category of European Indonesians who were considered European, but were also scolded into this color line. So they were not Totoks, they were not completely Dutch, but they were considered European, but they were still being discriminated against. They went to the Netherlands, they migrated to the Netherlands when Indonesia became independent, and they were not protected by a minority rights scheme. So, and instead of resorting to human rights is not the only game in town. What they did was that they advocated a solution to inequality. And they advocated a solution to segregation. They advocated a solution to them being left out of the labor market in the Netherlands. So what they were able to establish was a series of new privileges, a series of new rights, not through the minority rights, not through the human rights campaign, but through the process of gaining gaining access into the welfare state of the Netherlands. So this is also something that minorities teach us. It's not just a top-down game either by geopolitical great power states or well-meaning idealists fighting for their human rights. It's also the minorities themselves that carve out in far more creative and imaginative ways that we can think of. They carve out autonomies, sovereignty for themselves sometimes. And these are also processes that can teach us how it can be done. And this history of the Indo-Europeans in the Netherlands is, I think, a very interesting, a rich history. So there's also something good to be learned from history.
Thank you, Beatrice. I think we should go to the very final question. Matthijs has been waiting a very long time. So could you briefly state your question and you'll be the final one then.
Yeah, so it's perhaps not even a question. So as a Dutchman recently living in Canada, so I was reminded of the challenging founding of Canada, and especially in relation to Quebec, which, as you may well know or remember, was basically annexed by the British Empire in the 18th century. So a Canadian theorist has called attention to the fact that in political theory of the 18th century, there are sets of reasoning that state that for states to establish order by means of conquest can, in some situations, be valid. Well, it's obviously not what we want to hear, understand in this democratic age, but well, what we would like to be a democratic age, but like democracy as our framework, not monarchism and monarchic foundations. Even though monarchic foundations and attempt to re-establish that was very much the 1850s period, right? The period of 1815. So is there a way we can still use the theories and the thinking of these earlier times of this monarchic pre-democratic age for the benefit of of groups that need protection in a situation where there is an unbridgeable power divide between them and other parties? Very broad.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Matthijs, for this question. I'm a bit at loss. What I do think is that it's a short sentence that I stated in my presentation earlier, is that the granting of minority rights in 1815 was not a product of universalist aspirations. It was mostly, oftentimes, a product of settling indemnities for people who lost their territory. This is important because that explains the genealogy of the rights in that area. So if you take the French minority in Quebec, this was also a settling of minority rights as a product of the loss of the French minority of the territory. They were integrated in this new English-speaking lands, and in return they received some rights. So it was an indemnity rather than living up to a universalist claim. Since then, the French minority has undergone, and these minority have undergone tremendous struggles to be put on an equal footing, the English and the French minorities, on a more individualist human rights frame, and the struggle is still ongoing. There have been terrorist attacks in the 70s, for example, and nowadays the only thing that I know is that it's still a struggle because the provincial governments decide upon the minority rights, not the individual members of the minority themselves. So coming from a democratic point of view, there's still work to be done, I would say, to sort of take the minorities out of this history of settling indemnities and turning them into an individual right within a democracy. And I'm not sure at all how the Canadian government is doing in that regard. I have the feeling that it still is a problem in Canada.
Well, absolutely, I would say absolutely. But I mean, I'm not asking about Canada specifically, but there are other situations in the world where this kind of theory is kind of clashing against the issue of colonialism. I hate to give the example of Israel, but it seems to be the obvious one. So we will still need some kind of theories to think about, well, name it justice in this kind of situation, and perhaps the theories of Locke and something that comes out of this earlier age can still be of use. I would hope so.
I think it now subscribes more to a Hobbesian notion of security rather than to a Locke idea of freedom.
Yes, thank you for your for all your questions and reflections. I think we're coming to the end of our session, and as I'm moving here, the lights come on, so I'm realizing how late it is. So thank you all for your attention, and thank you, Beatrice and Federica, for your fantastic presentations. In 3 weeks' time, we will have our final Landecker seminar of this year with Gülay Türkmen from the University of Graz, who was previously in Göttingen and was also attached to the DAD network with the workshop seminar series. And she will be presenting on a new book under the banner of Islam on religion, nationalism, and ethnicity in Turkey, which should make for another fascinating seminar. Respondent will be Erly Osterk from the Metropolitan University in London. So if you are still working and not yet on holiday, I heartily recommend coming along for this final seminar. And with that, I wish you a lovely rest of your evening.